The forbidden lesson. There is a certain thrill that comes with forbidden knowledge, the kind of insight that feels dangerous to possess. The phrase "I shouldn't be teaching you this, but here we are" captures that exact feeling, the quiet sense that what follows might unsettle you, shift how you see the world, and perhaps make you a little less innocent. It implies a lesson that civilized people prefer to keep hidden, a truth about power, ambition, or human nature that society tries to bury beneath moral optimism. This tone of uneasy revelation makes the phrase an ideal frame for examining the thought of Niccolò Machiavelli, the Renaissance thinker whose name has become synonymous with political cunning, manipulation, and ruthless realism. His teachings, whether misinterpreted or not, have carried the weight of moral controversy for centuries. Yet they endure precisely because they expose what most moral systems avoid: the cold mechanics of survival and success. To study Machiavelli seriously is to cross a threshold. It means leaving behind the comforting idea that virtue always triumphs, or that morality and power are naturally aligned. Machiavelli does not write for the innocent. He writes for those who have seen the world's hypocrisy and are ready to understand it. His most famous work, The Prince 1513, reads less like an ethical treatise and more like a survival manual for power. Its lessons: it is better to be feared than loved. A prince must learn how not to be good, and men judge more by the eye than by the hand, continue to unsettle because they contradict the moral scripts that most political and social systems claim to uphold. Machiavelli does not simply advise deception. He warns that those who ignore deception are doomed by it. His teachings are not an endorsement of evil, but an invitation to realism. This video explores what might be called Machiavelli's warning, his reminder that beneath every ideal lies a battlefield of interests, and that the pursuit of power exposes the limits of morality. The title "I Shouldn't Be Teaching You This" fits his project perfectly. It suggests that he knew his lessons would scandalize polite society, yet felt compelled to teach them anyway. The following will examine Machiavelli's context, his central ideas, the paradoxes within his philosophy, and the moral dangers of applying his thought without restraint. In doing so, this essay aims to show why Machiavelli's disturbing insights remain essential, and how understanding them, without succumbing to them, can lead to a more mature view of politics, leadership, and human nature. Who Machiavelli was, and why context matters. To understand the force of Machiavelli's ideas, one must first understand the world he inhabited. Niccolò Machiavelli was born in Florence in 1469, during a time of extraordinary artistic and political turbulence. Italy was not a unified nation, but a patchwork of warring city-states: Florence, Venice, Milan, Naples, and the Papal States, each vying for dominance while foreign powers like France and Spain intervened in their affairs. Politics in Renaissance Italy was a ruthless game of shifting alliances, betrayals, and coups. Machiavelli's life was steeped in this environment. As a diplomat and secretary for the Florentine Republic, he witnessed firsthand the instability and treachery that defined Italian politics. When the Republic fell, and the Medici family returned to power in 1512, Machiavelli was dismissed, imprisoned, and tortured on suspicion of conspiracy. Exiled to his farm, he turned his experiences into reflection, and out of that reflection came The Prince. This context matters deeply because The Prince was not written from comfort, but from loss. It is a book born out of political failure and personal exile. Machiavelli was not a man of power instructing rulers from above. He was a man who had been discarded by power, writing to understand why. His tone, though pragmatic, carries a kind of tragic wisdom. He had seen how easily moral ideals collapse in the face of political necessity. Where others dreamed of the virtuous ruler, Machiavelli had seen the virtuous ruined. Thus, when he writes that a prince must learn how not to be good, it is not a celebration of wickedness, but an acknowledgement that survival in politics often requires actions that conventional morality condemns. He writes not to corrupt, but to awaken. Machiavelli's personal motives are often debated. Some argue that the prince was a desperate attempt to win favor with the Medici, a job application disguised as philosophy. Others see it as an act of bitter satire, a subtle warning to citizens about the nature of tyranny. Regardless of motive, the text's intellectual honesty is undeniable. Machiavelli sought to describe political life as it truly was, not as moralists imagined it to be. In doing so, he transformed political thought. Before him, writers like Plato, Augustine, and Aquinas saw politics as an extension of moral philosophy. After him, politics became an autonomous field of study, a realm governed by necessity rather than virtue. That shift is the root of what many call Machiavelli's dangerous wisdom, and it remains as unsettling now as it was in the 16th century. The core warning: human nature, power, and deceit. At the heart of Machiavelli's philosophy lies a dark anthropology, a view of human nature stripped of idealism. He warns that men are ungrateful, fickle, deceitful, cowardly, and greedy, and that any ruler who trusts them completely invites his own ruin. To Machiavelli, this is not cynicism, but realism. History, he argues, is filled with examples of noble leaders destroyed by their own goodness. He believed that humans are driven more by fear and self-interest than by loyalty or virtue. As such, political systems built solely on moral trust are destined to fail. Power, therefore, must be constructed on an understanding of human weakness, not moral perfection. This is the first warning. The enemy is not evil itself, but naivete. Power, for Machiavelli, is both an art and a necessity. It cannot be maintained by idealists who expect gratitude or moral consistency from others. He warns that he who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner affects his ruin than his preservation. In other words, leaders who cling to ideal standards in a corrupt world will be crushed by those willing to break them. This principle has enormous implications, not just for rulers, but for anyone in positions of authority. Teachers, executives, generals, and parents all confront the tension between moral principles and practical outcomes. Machiavelli's insight is not that morality is useless, but that moral effectiveness depends on understanding how people truly behave. This pragmatic focus is what makes his thought both dangerous and indispensable. Finally, deceit occupies a central role in Machiavelli's theory of power. To govern effectively, he suggests, one must sometimes conceal one's intentions, disguise one's motives, and even simulate virtues one does not possess. Men judge more by the eye than by the hand, he writes, for everyone can see what you appear to be, few really know what you are. This is not an endorsement of lying for pleasure, but an acknowledgement of perception as a political weapon. Appearance becomes a form of power, because most people are moved by symbols rather than truths. The warning here is subtle but profound. If you refuse to play the game of appearances, you will be ruled by those who do. Lessons from the prince: fear, cruelty, and fortune. Better to be feared than loved. Perhaps Machiavelli's most famous dictum, "It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both," captures the heart of his realism. In chapter 10th of The Prince, he argues that love is fragile because it depends on the goodwill of others, while fear is more reliable because it depends on the ruler's control. People will love you when it costs them nothing, but they will betray you when love collides with self-interest. Fear, properly managed, creates a more stable bond. Yet Machiavelli also warns that a ruler must avoid being hated. The key is balance. Inspire fear without cruelty, respect without dependence. It is a ruthless logic, but one grounded in political experience. A ruler who relies solely on affection is doomed to disappointment. A ruler who relies solely on terror is doomed to revolt. This principle, while harsh, has echoes in modern leadership theory. A manager who is only nice may be liked but not respected. One who is only authoritarian may achieve obedience but not loyalty. Machiavelli's advice anticipates this paradox centuries before psychology gave it language. His teaching is not that fear is good, but that love without strength is weak. Fear, understood as the disciplined enforcement of respect, can protect both ruler and realm. In this sense, Machiavelli's insight is not a call for cruelty, but a lesson in the importance of authority. Leadership that cannot command obedience will eventually collapse under pressure. Still, this idea carries moral danger. It tempts leaders to prioritize control over compassion and stability over justice. The moment fear crosses into hatred, the ruler's downfall becomes inevitable. Machiavelli understood this paradox deeply. His warning is not that fear should replace love, but that leaders must know how fragile love can be. Those who rule by virtue alone will eventually face the cruelty of circumstance. And it is that cruelty, not Machiavelli's advice, that makes his insight so difficult to ignore. The necessity of cruelty and deceit. Machiavelli's second major lesson concerns the use of cruelty. He distinguishes between cruelty well used and cruelty abused. Cruelty well used is applied swiftly, decisively, and only once, to secure stability. Cruelty abused is continuous, motivated by pleasure or revenge, and ultimately destroys legitimacy. Cesare Borgia, one of Machiavelli's archetypal rulers, used cruelty strategically. He crushed disorder in the Romagna through brutal measures, then executed his own lieutenant to win back public favor. For Machiavelli, such calculated harshness was not evil, but necessary. It demonstrated an understanding of timing, optics, and the psychology of fear. Deceit operates under similar logic. A ruler must learn to be both lion and fox, strong enough to deter enemies, clever enough to detect traps. Deception, in this framework, is not moral corruption, but strategic adaptation. The world is full of liars, Machiavelli argues. If you refuse to deceive, you simply hand the advantage to those who will. Here lies another layer of his warning. Honesty, though admirable, can be fatal when surrounded by duplicity. Politics, in his view, is not a realm of moral purity, but a perpetual contest of strategy. Those who cling too tightly to moral absolutism risk being devoured by the cunning. Yet even this advice contains restraint. Machiavelli does not glorify cruelty for its own sake. He praises it only when it serves a greater purpose, restoring order, preventing greater harm, or ensuring survival. Excessive cruelty, he warns, breeds hatred and revolt. His pragmatism thus carries a moral edge. Power is not license. Cruelty and deceit are tools of necessity, not habits of character. The danger lies in forgetting that distinction. Fortune, preparation, and adaptability. No ruler, no matter how wise, can escape the influence of fortune. For Machiavelli, fortuna, the unpredictable force of chance, controls half of human affairs. The other half, he insists, is within our power through virtu, a term he uses to describe energy, courage, and strategic intelligence. A great leader anticipates change and adapts before others do. he compares fortune to a river. When it floods, it devastates everything, but the prudent ruler builds dikes and levees in advance. Thus, foresight and adaptability are the highest political virtues. This insight gives Machiavelli's thought a dynamic quality. He does not advocate fatalism, he calls for boldness. The wise leader does not merely react to events, but shapes them. Success, therefore, depends less on moral goodness than on psychological and strategic flexibility. Those who cling stubbornly to one method, whether virtue or vice, will fail when circumstances change. True prudence lies in knowing when to be patient and when to be reckless. It is a lesson that transcends politics. Fortune favors those prepared for its storms, but fortune also exposes the limits of human control. Even the most prudent ruler cannot master every contingency. Machiavelli's warning, then, is twofold: prepare for chaos, but never believe you have conquered it. The illusion of total control is itself a form of blindness. In a world ruled partly by chance, survival depends on humility as much as strength. Fortune can be resisted, but never eliminated, a truth that modern leaders ignore at their peril. Machiavelli the Republican, the other side of the coin. Although The Prince made Machiavelli infamous, it represents only one facet of his political thought. In his later work, Discourses on Livy, he praises republican government and civic virtue over tyranny. Here, Machiavelli argues that freedom, not domination, is the most stable foundation of power. Republics, he writes, endure longer than principalities because they distribute authority among citizens and encourage participation. Where the Prince teaches survival in crisis, the Discourses teaches endurance in stability. The same man who advised princes to be cunning also advised citizens to guard their liberty fiercely. In the Discourses, Machiavelli introduces the idea that conflict, when properly channeled, can strengthen a republic. The tension between the nobles and the common people, he argues, generates balance. Corruption arises not from conflict, but from inequality and complacency. His realism thus extends beyond tyranny to democracy itself. Freedom survives only when citizens remain vigilant, adaptable, and unafraid of dissent. Even in a republic, he warns, human nature remains self-interested. Hence, institutions must be designed to counteract, not ignore, those tendencies. This is Machiavelli's Republican warning. Virtue must be armed, not innocent. This broader perspective reveals Machiavelli not as a nihilist, but as a political scientist. His aim was not to destroy morality, but to align it with reality. The same understanding of human weakness that justifies a prince's cunning also justifies the checks and balances of a republic. Power must be managed, not moralized. When viewed together, the Prince and the Discourses form a single argument, that effective governance, monarchical or republican, requires a clear-eyed understanding of human imperfection. If the Prince is the dark mirror, the Discourses is the light that frames it. Ethical tensions, realism, or corruption. Machiavelli's critics have long accused him of teaching evil. To call someone Machiavellian is to imply deception, manipulation, or moral emptiness. Yet this interpretation, while understandable, may miss the complexity of his thought. Machiavelli did not invent corruption, he merely described it honestly. His purpose was diagnostic, not prescriptive. He sought to uncover the mechanisms of power so that rulers might navigate them intelligently. In this sense, Machiavelli's realism was a form of moral courage, the willingness to see the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. Nevertheless, the moral risks of his approach are undeniable. By separating politics from morality, Machiavelli opened the door for leaders to justify any action in the name of necessity. This Machiavellian problem has haunted political philosophy ever since. Can necessity excuse immorality? If power demands cruelty, does that make cruelty right? Machiavelli never fully resolves this dilemma. His writings oscillate between admiration for cunning rulers and respect for virtuous republics. The tension is deliberate. He wanted readers to confront the uncomfortable truth that ethics and power rarely align perfectly, and that to govern effectively, one must sometimes choose between them. This ethical ambivalence is perhaps Machiavelli's true warning. He teaches not how to be evil, but how easy it is to become evil when necessity dictates. His work exposes the fragility of moral integrity under pressure. In a world governed by fear and self-interest, virtue requires not innocence, but resilience. To read Machiavelli properly is to wrestle with one's own capacity for compromise. The danger lies not in understanding his ideas, but in using them without conscience. The modern relevance of Machiavelli's warning. 5 centuries later, Machiavelli's insights remain disturbingly relevant. In modern politics, where media, image and narrative often outweigh substance, his observations about appearances feel prophetic. Politicians today survive less by honesty than by perception management. The same logic applies to corporations, institutions, and even social relationships. Reputation has become currency, image is influence. Machiavelli would not be surprised. He understood that power flows toward those who control appearances. His warning echoes through every public scandal and every carefully scripted apology. People judge what they see, not what they know. Beyond politics, Machiavelli's ideas pervade business, marketing, and even personal ambition. Machiavellian intelligence, a term now used in psychology, describes the capacity to navigate complex social hierarchies through strategic thinking and manipulation. In competitive environments, boardrooms, universities, or online platforms, his lessons on adaptability, timing, and perception remain as useful as ever. Yet they are also perilous. Applied without ethics, they create toxic cultures of distrust, where every interaction becomes a power play. The modern world, in its obsession with influence and control, risks proving Machiavelli right in the worst way. Yet Machiavelli's realism also has a constructive side. His insistence on preparation, adaptability, and self-awareness can inspire better leadership when balanced with moral integrity. A leader who understands power's dangers is less likely to abuse it. In this sense, Machiavelli's forbidden teachings serve as moral vaccines. They expose us to small doses of corruption so that we can build immunity. The goal is not to imitate the tyrant, but to survive among them without losing one's humanity. The danger of becoming what you study. There is, however, a final danger in learning from Machiavelli, that one might internalize his lessons too deeply. Once you begin to see the world through a Machiavellian lens, it is hard to stop. Every gesture looks strategic, every compliment suspicious, every friendship transactional. This paranoia, while protective in moderation, corrodes trust and meaning. A life governed entirely by calculation is a lonely one. Machiavelli teaches us how to survive among wolves, but he cannot teach us how to love among humans. The seduction of Machiavellian thinking lies in its apparent clarity. It promises mastery in a chaotic world. If you just understand the rules of power, you will never be betrayed again. But this illusion can consume its believer. The world becomes a chessboard, and everyone else mere pieces. The result is not wisdom, but isolation. History is full of leaders who read the prince too literally: Napoleon, Stalin, and countless others. Men who mistook cunning for wisdom and found themselves destroyed by the very ruthlessness they embraced. To resist this descent, one must read Machiavelli critically. His teachings are not commandments but cautions. He reveals how power works, not how it ought to work. The mature reader learns to extract his insights without absorbing his cynicism, to understand fear without spreading it, to see deceit without practicing it, and to recognize necessity without glorifying it. In that balance lies the true mastery of Machiavelli's warning. Conclusion: the courage to see clearly. The phrase "I shouldn't be teaching you this, but here we are" captures the moral tension that defines Machiavelli's thought. That his lessons were unsettling, that they stripped away comforting illusions about virtue and justice. Yet he also knew that ignorance of power's realities was far more dangerous. His warning is not an invitation to cruelty, but a call to clarity. In a world where ideals often disguise ambition, where appearances conceal motives, and where morality and necessity collide, the ability to see clearly is a form of courage. Machiavelli forces us to confront the limits of idealism. He reminds us that virtue without strength is fragile, and strength without virtue is monstrous. The challenge, then, is not to reject his teachings, but to master them responsibly, to recognize when fear is useful, when deceit is fatal, and when fortune demands courage rather than purity. The forbidden knowledge he offers is only dangerous to those who misunderstand it. For the rest, it serves as armor, a way to navigate a corrupt world without being consumed by it. So yes, perhaps he should not have taught us this. But here we are. To ignore his warning is to repeat the mistakes of the naive and the powerless. To understand it, and yet remain moral despite it, is to rise above both tyranny and innocence. That is the paradoxical gift of Machiavelli's wisdom, not the celebration of darkness, but the illumination of it, so that we may walk through it with open eyes,